My name is Matt Hoffman. I am a scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory. I work primarily on climate science and modeling using large-scale climate models. And I specifically work on the ice sheet component of our Department of Energy climate model.
And what do you typically do in a day?
Yeah, so in a typical day, it's a mixture of a lot of collaborative meetings. A lot of our projects include dozens or hundreds of people, so there's a lot of breakout teams and smaller groups that will either meet in person or over the phone and discuss the progress of projects and planning of projects. So there's a lot of working with other people. And then there's a lot of computer coding, debugging code, compiling code, running code. That's followed by often babysitting simulations on large supercomputers that might take days or weeks to run to completion. Sometimes you gotta start them over because you screw things up. Then there's analyzing results and writing up papers, and then mixed in with that will be mentoring students or postdocs.
Oh, so you have students there.
Yeah, we have students typically during the summer, and then postdocs, of course, year-round. But some students will come at other times of year as well. I'd say so. Our climate group here is about 20 to 25 people, and about half of that is permanent staff, and then the other half are postdocs. And the student population fluctuates from maybe 2 to 10, depending on the time of year.
So these are students of different collaborators across the U.S.?
Exactly. So the typical situation for students they'd be one of our collaborators at a U.S. institution, and the students would come for the course of the summer, and then sometimes they'll come for a semester or two, depending on where they are in their degree. And the students range anywhere from, in some cases, high school students, but more like commonly undergrads, but most of them are master's or PhD students.
And out of curiosity, like how much of your time do you spend every day like with people, and how much do you spend like solitary confinement in front of your computer?
In my cage?
Yeah.
It's probably about half and half.
Okay, that's interesting. I would have thought that, you know, a teaching job would be a lot more people focused, and it probably is more, but I'm surprised at how much you spend with time spent with people.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest surprises to me as I worked this job was how much time is spent collaboratively, either in meetings, which are sometimes, as meetings are, not productive, but often one-on-one or on the phone. I mean, so little of our work is single PI work or 2 or 3 person work. It's often 5 people, 10 people, 20 people all trying to work out issues with these massive models. And so you really need to be able to work very well with other people and get along with different people.
So is that typical for other groups at Los Alamos?
Yeah, I think that's pretty standard for national labs in general. I think the degree to which that is the case will vary, but kind of the mission of the labs and of the Department of Energy Science is to kind of do larger scale projects that couldn't be done at the university level, and that really need sustained resources from a program over many years and sustained staff. And so most projects are quite large and long.
Yeah. So what skills kind of leads into what skills you might have acquired or maybe didn't acquire in grad school that you need on a day-to-day basis, like maybe people skills?
Yeah, so depending on your grad school experience, you may or may not have acquired those collaborative skills. I think I got a good dose of it, but it's more something I've learned on the job. I would say I'm surprised at how much I use kind of core science and glaciology that I learned in grad school, and how often I'm doing math, either algebra or calculus, and even something like unit conversion and dimensional analysis. I do that a lot, and that's surprising.
I do that a lot too, actually.
Yeah, it's like you run these big models and you want to make sure that what they're telling you is at least sensible. You're not going to reproduce their calculations, but you need to know that things are the right order of magnitude and things like that. So there's a lot of that happening. And then lots of writing and data analysis. So lots of writing. So I'm sure I could have used more writing skills in grad school, and I would recommend people always try to work on that.
Mm-hmm. What parts of the job do you find the most challenging?
I think something some people struggle with is balancing your personal interests and scientific goals with the needs of these larger projects. And that's one thing I think a lot of the people who have left the team struggled with that. I've found that it's with a little bit of foresight and planning, you can kind of manage to tackle the things you want to tackle en route to tackling the things the project needs. But that also requires people skills and a little bit of politics to kind of negotiate to make sure your interests and needs are heard at the planning process of a lot of these projects.
So that kind of feeds into how you get evaluated. Like, are you evaluated at all on your individual contributions to science, or is it really primarily the team contributions?
Yeah, we're evaluated in a couple different ways. There is some complexity because there's kind of the project level, and then there's the laboratory management level. And for example, our project spans 8 different Department of Energy laboratories. So there's kind of 2 parallel management tracks going on. And in terms of personal evaluation at the project level, if you're not meeting your milestones and you're not contributing the things that are required by the project, you might not be a part of the next phase of the project. So there is kind of a job security, at least, to continue in that same area.
Does that mean that you get fired or you get reassigned to something?
You wouldn't get fired. I mean, it is possible to get fired, but that's much more egregious problems or long-term problems that would lead to that. But what's more likely is you would get reassigned to different work. And so as a climate scientist, if this primary Department of Energy or system model project were to get canceled, or I was no longer asked to participate, there are some other climate modeling projects which I could try to work on. But if none of those worked out, then I may be forced to consider work in other fluid dynamics applications, for example. And so I wouldn't worry about losing my job, but I would be concerned about the possibility of having to work on applications that I wasn't interested in. Like, for example, designing a better diesel engine or modeling nuclear explosions, things like that,
right,
which are all things that are done at the lab using the same sorts of fluid dynamics tools.
So how do you fit in time to do your own scientific research?
Well, for example, we're building a new ice sheet model, and one of the things we need to do is verify and validate that the model's doing what we think it should do. And so we can define how we evaluate it and what that goal will look like. So we can choose a scientific application of interest to us, or to me, myself, that will allow us to use the model for a specific problem of interest.
Okay.
We can also help we are the ones defining what new needs there are for the model. So for example, research interest of mine is subglacial hydrology. So I've been able to promote the need for a subglacial hydrology model within the ice sheet model as a key goal that we need to accomplish in the next 5 years. And along the way, I get to do subglacial hydrology science.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, where the day is maybe 5 years long, we need to have a deliverable that we've completed these new model physics capabilities, and the model is working for the large scale global problems that the program requires, but we're able to follow our own science and write papers to get to that point.
Okay. And what aspects of your job do you find the most enjoyable?
I found I really enjoy working on these large teams with a lot of different people, and it's really satisfying to be a part of something that's much bigger than myself. That could only be done with the contribution of dozens and dozens of people who have expertise that I could never in my life, learn the breadth of. So, really great atmospheric scientists, ocean scientists, sea ice scientists, biogeochemists, the whole breadth to build this huge Earth system model that I'm contributing one small piece to. But by doing so, we're in a position to, for example, make projections of sea level rise from a model that's part of the entire Earth system and isn't just a standalone ice sheet model.
Right.
And there's very few places in the world that could give me that opportunity. So I find that extremely exciting. Another area that is fun is just getting to run computer code on some of the largest supercomputers in the world. Like, even after doing this for years, it's still really exciting to log into some massive supercomputer and get to do whatever I want within reason.
So did you know in graduate school that you thought maybe a research focused career would be the way for you to go?
I think I had a suspicion, but I never really had a clear path of where I wanted to end up.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was open to an academic path, but kind of fell into research and really enjoyed it. I'm someone who kind of gets narrowly focused on what I'm working on, and I don't get to do that as much as I'd like even at this job, but it does allow me to focus on different problems for extended periods of time with fewer distractions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I've talked to some people who are in teaching focused jobs who knew in high school they wanted to be teachers and that they needed to have a PhD to get to where they wanted. So they just got the research chops in order to teach.
Oh, that's right.
And so I'm curious because teaching is a big part of most academic jobs, I'm curious if people who are on research tracks had the opposite experience, opposite and equal experience with the research desire.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never really wanted to teach, but the irony is the times when I have taught, I've really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So I'm sure I could have ended up in a different path, but all along, that wasn't the plan. And so here I am.
Yeah. How many hours do you work typically in a week?
Our work, let's see, I typically work probably 40 to 50 hours. There's some times where it goes substantially higher if there's a deadline or a code release coming up, something like that. But on average, the work-life balance expectations are very reasonable at here, and I think at most national labs.
And are there seasons to your job? I know for, most academic jobs are very seasonal, but I imagine that yours is pretty steady year round.
Yeah, I think it's relatively speaking fairly steady. If anything, we're the opposite of academic job where things are busier in the summer because that's when a lot of summer students come and our population swells. And so there's more mentoring duties and other smaller projects going on, a lot more seminars going on because we have so many visitors. And in addition to summer students, we often have colleagues who come to visit us during the summer because they're free.
Mm-hmm.
So that tends to be the busier time of year. In our small town we live in kind of swells in population and there's more traffic and things take a little longer. But other than that, the seasons aren't fixed. It's more like we have a big code release of the model and the months leading up to that will be extremely hectic, but those sorts of events are not on a set schedule.
So for traditional academic jobs, there's also, on top of a seasonal cycle, there's kind of a longer term cycle with promotion. And so do you have like set promotion schedules at Los Alamos that you adhere to? And do you find that you need to ramp up your productivity to meet those goals?
Not in the same way. There are different kind of scientist levels that would correspond roughly to early, mid, and later career. But you aren't required to meet them at specific times. So if you wanted to have a more casual trajectory and try to reach for those higher levels at a later point in your career, that is an acceptable path. Mm-hmm. And so there's not necessarily a big ramp up before promotion level. If you were very ambitious and you wanted to proceed more quickly, then you would be doing things like trying to get out more papers, chair committees, put together conferences, things like that to demonstrate you were at a position to move onward. But that's really self-motivated. There isn't a laboratory timeline that you would try to follow.
Okay. Is there a tenure equivalent or is it just a simple promotion?
It's simple promotion, and if anything, the equivalent is the difference is just getting a staff position to begin with. They're not guaranteed permanent, but they are. It's pretty hard to get fired. So once you are in the door, you're kind of good. And
Okay.
so most staff positions are hired from postdocs. Occasionally we hire staff at higher levels directly if we have specific needs, but the majority of staff, and I think this is true across most of at least the Department of Energy national labs, are hired from the postdoc pool. So if this is a career path someone's interested in, you really have the best chance if you come as a postdoc and take that route. And that also, it's kind of like a trial in that the scientist has the opportunity to see what work and life is like at the laboratory, and the laboratory has a chance to see how that person would fit into the overall programs.
Right.
Before hiring them permanently. And because a lot of the projects are so collaborative and so long-term, the labs tend to be a little bit risk averse in hiring people who might not fit in with the dynamic of the group, because it is kind of a long-term commitment.
So how much is hiring pretty active at the national labs? Like it's kind of always ongoing, or it depends on the research group?
Yeah, it depends on the area and on the lab. And right now, Los Alamos and I think many other labs are hiring pretty actively. At Los Alamos in particular, there's going to be a wave of retirements in the next 5 or 10 years, and so there's
been saying that for years. Everywhere.
Yeah, well, so they're very actively hiring, and the estimate is something like in 5 years' time, about a third of the workforce here will be new.
Wow.
So it's actually right now is a pretty big time.
So how would somebody get a foot in the door with a postdoc? Is there a postdoc fellowship program?
There are postdoc fellowship programs with some more prestigious fellowships, but most postdocs are hired on to specific projects. So the best way is to get familiar with scientists working at the labs and finding out what they do. Some of us, we can at times be kind of insular compared to the academic community. We have our own set of Department of Energy conferences and workshops we go to that often makes it such that we have less time to spend in maybe the traditional academic circles. But just getting familiar with what's happening at the labs and meeting a few of the scientists is a great way to get a foot in the door. Coming as a summer student or other short sort of intern is a really great way to see what things are like, and it's a pretty low risk for the person involved. And then the last thing is all jobs are posted on the employment, all postdoc positions are posted on the general employment pages for the labs. So you can just keep an eye on what's being advertised there.
Okay. And what's the workplace culture like?
Yeah, it's very, as I've said, it's very collaborative and communal. It's fairly casual. I mean, part of that is we're in a fairly rural area of New Mexico, so things are a little more relaxed than they are in other parts of the country. I would say because a lot of the projects require so much working together, you see less of very large egos of a single scientist trying to drive their agenda and fewer ego clashes. Of course, there's still differing opinions about the direction different projects should go and internal politics like anywhere, but there's, compared to what I've seen at universities and some other non-DOE laboratories, I think there's fewer big heads that are trying to make everyone part of their hierarchy.
So is that something then that the lab takes pretty seriously when they look at postdocs, is how they fit into that sort of workplace culture?
Yes, definitely. I know there's been situations where very skilled potential postdocs end up not being the best choice for a team just based on personal dynamics.
That's interesting.
or and not personalities per se, but willingness to work
Yeah.
collaboratively with other people.
Yeah. So I wonder how a graduate student would demonstrate that in their CV, that they're capable of that. I guess you would mostly be interested in their scientific skills anyway, and then
Yeah.
give them a test run by doing a postdoc there.
Yeah, at the postdoc level, it's rarely the case that that's going to come up. It's more the next step if they were interested in staying for a permanent position and there was an opening for them to do so. At that point, the ability to work as part of the team really matters. And I would say about halfway through your postdoc here is about the time when you need to start thinking about, is this what I really want to do? Because if it is, then you would position yourself to make yourself invaluable to the project you're working on and really start to learn, what are the maintenance needs and what are the other tasks that this project really needs that maybe people aren't excited about, that I can fit in and make myself indispensable. And those choices may maybe at odds with how you would be spending your time if you wanted to get an academic position and you needed to write a bunch of high profile papers, for example. So there kind of comes a point in your postdoc where you make a strategic choice as to, am I going to aim to demonstrate that I want to be a part of this team, or am I going to try to build up my scientific CV so that I can launch from here to somewhere else? And there's not a right answer. It's just different people and where they want to end up.
Was it hard to make that decision for yourself?
It was a little hard, although my lack of success at applying to academic jobs in the first year certainly was a motivation. And I also increasingly found I enjoyed working with the team here and I enjoyed the opportunities. And there was also practical considerations. My wife is also a scientist. National labs are great places to solve the two-body problem because they're really big institutions with doing a very wide range of things. I'm an earth scientist, she's a biochemist, so we weren't going to get hired in the same group. And so she was doing really well in her postdoc, and we both managed to get permanent positions. And so we were just happy with the way our careers and our life worked out. So it became a pretty easy choice.
Okay. Given that the teamwork part of your job is so important, is there specific training that they provide for that kind of thing?
No, and that would be a good suggestion. There's lots of other training though, but
Are there? What kind of training do you get?
Well, I'm being a bit facetious. I mean, it's a bureaucratic government institution, so there's a lot of online training about where the nearest fire exit is, and what to do in different situations, and what sort of material you need approval before you can release to the public, and things like this. Which it all makes sense given that we're working at a national security laboratory. But for someone in a application that doesn't have kind of sensitive information involved with it can sometimes feel burdensome.
Yeah. I remember talking to a colleague who was once working at NASA, who said that she was surprised to find that they were trained to be like science leaders in the very beginning of her career there. And I thought that was a really great idea. I mean, if you want to have a group of scientists that are national or international leaders, there's no better way to do it but then to invest in their like soft skills, right? So it's kind of surprising that other places don't do that kind of thing.
Yeah, and my experiences are just what I've experienced in this group at this lab. I think there's something like 12 national labs overall, and they're quite diverse, and they're all managed by private contractors. People working here used to be government employees, like people at NASA, for example, but in the 80s, the management of all of the labs was privatized. So each lab is a little bit different because they're each run by different entities. So the culture, I think, varies a bit from lab to lab.
How much does the the political, like any kind of political election affect your day-to-day job?
Not directly, but I would say I feel a step closer to what Congress is doing than when I worked in academic settings.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our funding comes directly as line items in the budget for the Department of Energy. And so if Congress chose to just strike the line that funds our system modeling, I'd be doing something else tomorrow, or not tomorrow, October 1st.
Okay.
So it's easy to get caught up in being concerned about that, but historically, we are fairly well protected and changes happen slowly. I've heard examples of programs at the labs changing quickly, but in being here 7 years, I think there's only one example I've heard of where it was a real big shift to what people were working on from 1 month to the next.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's more of a gradual funding shift over time.
Yeah.
And despite a lot of political concerns in the last years related to climate topics, our funding has not changed noticeably.
Oh, okay.
So it's easy to get worked up about it, but the reality is, and the advice given to us by the laboratory and our managers, is that the best thing we can do is continue doing good work and demonstrate that we're doing quality science.
Mm-hmm.
And that advice actually, I believe, is good advice.
I think that's probably true for every academic job, either doing a good job in your research or doing a good job in your teaching and just focusing on that so much more than anything else.
Yeah, and I would say, as I alluded to before, one advantage to the lab is if funding changed or if your personal interests change. There's a whole huge wide range of things going on here that are extremely fascinating. And a lot of these things you couldn't even do in academia, or, you know, a lot of it's classified work, but even outside the classified work, there's just really cutting edge topics, very kind of multidisciplinary and trying to find solutions to things, and potential problems to work on that will have immediate impact and not be, you know, research that won't affect society for until decades down the line. So, you know, if I got tired of ice sheet modeling and climate science, there's a whole world of things here for me to try to explore.
Do you feel like there are opportunities for you to go into like a different trajectory there other than sort of a science focus, like maybe more administrative?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunities there. And there's a lot of opportunities to manage projects where, you know, you're not necessarily doing the day-to-day science, but you're managing a group of a dozen or more people and multi-million-dollar budgets. And at that point, it's more of a management problem than a science problem, but you still have to have a scientific background to understand the objectives and help to find them. There's also opportunities to interface with the administrative agencies. So for example, a couple of years ago, my wife got an assignment to work for the Bioenergy Technology Office that is part of the Department of Energy. And so she was there giving them advice as a scientist as to what sort of priorities they should be setting for funding in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, that's cool.
I have another good friend who is actually working in the White House in the Obama administration in the Office of Science and Technology Policy as an advisor to the president, effectively.
So is that like just a term away or something, or a little bit of time away and you can come back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so those are typically 1 to 2 year assignments. And then you come back, and then after getting that sort of experience, once you come back, there's lots of new opportunities here about, now that you've seen what, you know, the Department of Energy or what the White House priorities are, now you can help inform the laboratory and where it decides to focus its resources.
That's cool. What is a reasonable starting salary for someone out of a postdoc, say?
Yeah, so At Los Alamos, all of the salary guidelines are set for the different
Mm.
types of positions. So a starting salary for a postdoc is around 75,000 and goes up with each year out from your PhD. And for a early to mid-career staff member, it's anywhere in the kind of 100 to 125,000 range.
And that's like pretty reasonable for the standard of living in Los Alamos.
Yeah, I mean we're a small town in the middle of nowhere, but for being a small town, it's more expensive than your average town of 10,000 people in the middle of nowhere. But
Mm.
yeah, it's a very comfortable salary. I would say that at least in Los Alamos, because it is quite comfortable, you see more single income households than I've seen in other parts of the country because it's easy to pull off here.
Hmm. Do you know if other labs, like I'm thinking of what's the one in the Berkeley area, Livermore?
Well, there's two. There's Livermore and then there's Berkeley National Lab.
Okay, like do they pay at a different scale because of their setting?
I'm not sure, actually.
Yeah, I wonder.
I suspect they may.
I was talking with a colleague at a small liberal arts college who said starting salaries, even for Seattle, were like 65,000.
Right.
And so you kind of have to weigh, your desire to be in a certain type of institution with the location
Yes.
that it's in, because sometimes you won't be able to afford to live there. Even married, sometimes you can't afford.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so my last question is, if you could start all over again, what would you change about your career path and why?
I wouldn't change anything. I'm really happy with where I ended up and the path I took to get here. And I think, well, at each step of my career, I ended up doing something very different from what I had done before. It was all within the realm of glaciology, but within that constraint, I went from heavy field work to more modeling or entirely modeling based. And I went from doing field work or focusing geographically on small US glaciers to Antarctica to Greenland and back again, and different parts of the glaciology system. And I felt like that really, even though it was a lot of work and challenging every step of the way, it gave me a broad set of tools and experiences. And I just learned a lot at each step, and each opportunity just magically led to another one. And I think that it's not magic, it's making the right connections and being willing to step out of your comfort zone and try new things and go to new places.
Your work, even though it has been in these different places and different, maybe different specific scientific focus, there is a linkage, in just understanding glacier hydrology throughout, I think, most of your work, right?
Yeah, but I feel like that was somewhat fortuitous. I don't know that. I mean, like when I've given some talks about things I've done in the past, I form this path where it started on superglacial hydrology and then went through the glacier to subglacial hydrology, and you can kind of chart this hydrologic course in my career. But I feel like that ended up being fortuitous. It was not planned or designed.
Yeah.
Maybe some of those opportunities presented themselves because they weren't they could branch off of things I'd done before, but it wasn't by design by any means.
But maybe that speaks to kind of your point of somebody being willing to step outside of their immediate comfort zone, right? And
Yeah,
the skills that you've learned and think, oh, I can still, understand a part of the system that is fascinating to me, but it's slightly different set of physics maybe applied.
and I'm also happy about having done that, because now that I'm approaching the middle of my career, I'm realizing the opportunities to branch out like that go down, and the best time to do that is at the beginning, when you are naturally moving around every few years and there's new projects that are coming about. And at this point, I'm more kind of locked in. It would be harder to change course at this time. And so I'm glad I got a lot of that breadth when I was able to more easily.
Are you disappointed that you're locked in, or you're okay with it?
I'm okay with it. I'm happy with what I'm doing. And so
That's
good to me. I mean, I'm still keeping my eyes and ears out for exciting other possibilities, but I'm not actively looking to change what I'm doing.
Okay. And do you have anything that maybe we haven't touched on that you think is like a key piece of advice for somebody who might wants to pursue a career at Los Alamos or a different national lab?
Well, I mentioned this earlier. If you're at all interested in National Lab, try to come visit as a student. And that might even be 4 weeks. You know, a lot of those visits can be short, or just come out and give a talk. One thing in particular at Los Alamos, we're in a pretty remote location. We don't happen to have scientists just wandering through northern New Mexico who want to give a talk as they're traveling through. And so we're always excited and eager to have visitors, and people bring in fresh perspectives from outside, and that includes graduate students. So if you're interested in a lab, contact a scientist there and kind of make that connection and offer to come visit.
So I imagine that there's probably opportunities for every aspect of geoscience.
Yeah, I'd say at each lab, there may be subsets of the whole breadth of geoscience, but yeah, there's a lot happening here. There's a really big seismology group that both is looking at earth science applications as well as national security applications. There's a lot of permafrost and Arctic research, and other kind of land biogeochemistry. There's a lot of tree mortality research here is another interesting niche that there's a lot going on. So each lab may have certain kind of projects or specialties, but yeah, things are quite broad.
Okay. Well, thanks, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. This was fun.